up the extra oxygen and continue to increase flow throughout the body to deliver that oxygen and then remove the CO2 from the tissues and get it back to the pulmonary capillaries. So inevitably, when you increase respiratory activity to improve oxygen delivery, CO2 removal, you also have to increase blood flow. The two go hand in hand. Right? So you need both to accomplish the overall goal of providing more oxygen and more CO2 removal. So this reflex coordinates the two systems. Its main job is to regulate respiratory activity, but it does influence cardiovascular at the same time and coordinates them. And so both systems increase in activity together, and both systems decrease in activity together, right, depending on the needs of the body. Now, for example, as you transition from rest to exercise, both systems become more active to support the increased metabolic demands of the body. And then when you transition from exercise to rest, both systems decrease in activity, right? Because you don't need quite the same supply anymore. Demand has gone down. So who is primarily responsible for short-term neuroregulation of mean arterial pressure? The baroreceptor reflex. That's its only focus, main focus and only focus. But we have two systems now, or two reflexes, that provide input to the cardiovascular control centers. So we already covered baroreceptor reflex. Now we're looking at chemoreceptor reflex. And the chemoreceptors are found in the same place as the baroreceptors, like the carotid sinus. If you have a drop in pH, a drop in O2 levels, and an increase in CO2 levels, that either reflects a sudden increase in metabolic demands of the body or a sudden decrease in supply of blood to the tissues of the body, like in response to hemorrhage or something like that. So let's assume metabolic demand has gone up and we haven't quite caught up yet with increased ventilation and blood flow. So momentarily we see a drop in pH and O2 and an increase in CO2. And these two are connected. When CO2 goes up, it causes a drop in pH. So by ventilating more and blowing off more CO2, you fix both problems. You bring CO2 back to normal and at the same time pH back up to normal. So the chemoreceptors are detecting these imbalances, these stimuli. And it sends signals both to the respiratory control centers, which are in the medulla and pons, as well as the cardiovascular control centers in the medulla. We want to increase cardiac output. We want to improve blood flow. So we want heart rate to go up. We want stroke volume to go up, which means stimulating cardioacceleratory center and inhibiting cardioinhibitory center. So the dial on sympathetic output goes up, parasympathetic goes down. Vasomotor center, also stimulated, right, which is the other sympathetic center, to turn the dial up on sympathetic output to blood vessels. And vasoconstriction would help increase mean arterial pressure, which is the driving force for blood flow. Right, so cardiac output is increased, mean arterial pressure is increased. And then up at the top, by stimulating the respiratory centers, breathing rate is increased. And not only will we breathe more often, more breaths per minute, but deeper breaths as well. And by doing both, we will be able to get more oxygen into the blood and increase oxygen delivery to the tissues, and at the same time remove more CO2. And removing the excess CO2 fixes the pH as well, brings us back to normal levels. Simple enough? Long-term endocrine regulation of mean arterial pressure. Primary goal of the endocrine system is to regulate ECF composition and volume, thus blood volume and blood pressure. And we covered all of these hormones when we covered endocrine system, so this is all review. Just looking at it in the context of regulating blood pressure now. You could say that the baroreceptor reflex is aimed at directly changing blood pressure, so that when it's too low or too high, we bring it back to the normal range. The endocrine reflex indirectly regulates blood pressure by directly regulating blood volume. That's the goal of endocrine. The endocrine system is maintaining a normal blood volume, which is essential to maintaining a normal blood pressure. If you have too much fluid in the system, right, which is a closed system of blood vessels, too much fluid, you'll have too much pressure, right? If you lose too much fluid, you won't have enough pressure. So long term, it's all about keeping volume stable, and that should help keep pressure stable. We rely really on two things to maintain blood volume over time. One, proper intake of fluid. Right? You don't take in enough, blood volume is going to be too low. You take in too much fluid, volume's too high. So we want to take in the right amount of fluid. Stimulate thirst when we're running low on volume, inhibit thirst when we're running high on volume. And then telling the kidneys what to do with the fluid in the filtrate that is formed as the kidneys filter the blood, 24/7. And if we're running low on volume, we tell the kidneys, hang on to what we have. And not only hang on to what we have, we're going to drink fluid, hopefully, to actually elevate blood volume. Right? Because if you think about it, Ang2, ADH, aldosterone, they can't truly increase blood volume unless you're actually consuming water. Because if your blood volume is low, and we're just telling the kidneys to conserve what you have, already what you have isn't enough. So obviously conserving what you have is not going to increase anything. You have to be consuming fluid on top of that. Some of the same hormones that tell the kidneys to increase reabsorption of salt and water also tell the hypothalamus to stimulate thirst, to increase the drive for fluid intake. ADH, aldosterone, and Ang2 increase blood volume, long-term effect. ADH and Ang2 increase TPR, that's more of an immediate effect. And both increase mean arterial pressure. There is overlap, so we tend to think of sympathetic, or the nervous system in general, as being responsible for short-term changes, producing an immediate response that lasts a short period of time. We think of hormones, the endocrine system is doing the opposite, controlling processes over an extended period of time that take a while to produce their effects. But there's some overlap. What can the sympathetic nervous system do to actually reduce urine output over time, to help us conserve the fluid that we have? Has to do with constricting particular vessels. What can the sympathetic nervous system do to help what the endocrine system is doing to conserve blood volume? Right. Reduce blood flow to the kidneys. If there's less flow and therefore pressure in the capillaries of the kidneys, then there's less filtrate formation. And if there's less filtrate formation, there's less urine production. If there's less urine production and urine output, then that means more fluid is being conserved and kept in the body. Okay, so the sympathetic nervous system is helping to do what the kidneys, or what the hormones are ultimately responsible for, getting the kidneys to conserve what we have. Likewise, what are hormones doing immediately that overlap with what the nervous system is doing? Vasoconstriction. Which hormones are vasoconstrictors? Vasopressin, that's where the name comes from, which is ADH. Ang2. Aldosterone? Nope. Ang2 and ADH. And catecholamines, of course. So there's overlap between the two systems. Hormones can do something to help immediately. Mostly what they do is long-term. Nervous system, mostly what it does is a very rapid short-term change, but can have long-term effects by reducing blood flow to the kidneys. All three of these hormones, ADH, aldosterone, Ang2, are part of the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone pathway. In reality, it should be called the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone, ADH pathway. And notice all three hormones start with an A. ADH, aldosterone, Ang2, AAA. It should be called that because Ang2 doesn't just lead to aldosterone secretion. I mean, that's where the name comes from. Renin, Ang2, aldosterone pathway, because renin leads to the production of more Ang2. Ang2 leads to the secretion of aldosterone. But Ang2 also targets the hypothalamus, stimulating SON neurons, supraoptic nuclei neurons, to release ADH. So really should be called renin, Ang2, aldosterone, ADH pathway. So you can assume whenever Ang2 levels go up, aldosterone and ADH levels will also go up.
What do you want us to call this pathway?
Oh, I don't care. Call it Henry, it's fine. Okay. You just need to know how it works. In response to a drop in blood pressure, release of renin, an enzyme, not a hormone, from the kidneys catalyzes the formation of Ang2, which in turn stimulates secretion of vasopressin, or ADH, and aldosterone. As vasoconstrictors, ADH and Ang2 reinforce what the sympathetic nervous system is doing, which includes vasoconstriction. At the kidneys, ADH and aldosterone work together to increase water and salt reabsorption. And by putting more salt and water back in the bloodstream, increasing blood volume, and therefore increasing venous return, increasing cardiac output, increasing mean arterial pressure. Now again, this is only true if what else is happening at the same time. ADH and aldosterone can only increase blood volume if you are also drinking water. Because again, conserving what you have isn't going to increase blood volume if what you have already isn't enough. This is a preview of what we'll look at in urinary system chapter. In all, we'll look at 8 actions of Ang2. You can see that it actually increases sympathetic activity, and that's happening at the medulla. Ang2 actually stimulates the vasomotor center and the cardioacceleratory center. So Ang2 increases sympathetic output. At the same time, sympathetic output increases Ang2. Both increase together. They both affect one another. And the connection is sympathetic output to the kidneys is responsible for the release of renin in the first place. That's shown here. Increased sympathetic output to the kidneys increases renin release. Renin leads to Ang2. Ang2 targets the medulla, among other targets, and stimulates increased sympathetic output. Kind of like positive feedback, right? They're helping each other out. They're increasing each other. When we get to the urinary system chapter, we'll look at the 3 mechanisms that lead to increased renin secretion. One of which is epi-norepi from sympathetic fibers binding to beta receptors on special cells in the kidneys, the ones that release renin. That's what's happening. Epi-norepi stimulates beta-1 receptors, increasing renin secretion. But that level of detail will come again later. More renin means more angiotensinogen getting converted to Ang1. Once you make Ang1, it will automatically get converted to Ang2 because ACE is always available. So in this pathway, what limits the production of Ang2 is renin, not ACE. And renin is the one that we control. We secrete more or less of. What happens to renin secretion if you have high blood pressure?
Goes down.
Goes down. Ang2 stimulates thirst. Ang2 is a vasoconstrictor. Ang2 increases secretion of ADH. as well as aldosterone. And there's still more effects we haven't talked about. But Ang2 does a lot. And everything it does can be traced back to increasing blood pressure. Right? More aldosterone, more blood pressure. More ADH, more blood pressure. More drinking fluid, more blood pressure. Vasoconstrict, more blood pressure. It all leads to an increase in blood pressure. This is why ACE inhibitors are such powerful drugs. If you can inhibit this enzyme, ACE, then you'll dramatically reduce the amount of Ang2 being produced, which in turn means less aldosterone, less ADH, less water intake, less constriction. And all of that results in lower blood volume, lower blood pressure. So people with hypertension often take ACE inhibitors, and it does a lot of different things to help lower volume and pressure. ANP, BNP. So now we're looking at the opposite scenario. Rather than starting with low MAP, now we've got high MAP. High volume, high pressure. In response to high volume and high pressure, what happens to renin secretion? It goes down. As renin goes down, Ang2 goes down. As Ang2 goes down, ADH and aldosterone go down. And just by reducing the amount of Ang2, ADH, aldosterone, you decrease vasoconstriction throughout the body, and you decrease conservation of salt and water. Basically, without ADH and aldosterone, the kidneys start to excrete large amounts of salt and water rather than reabsorb it. That's probably enough to reduce volume and pressure back to normal, but we often see examples of overlap, multiple pathways doing the same thing, which is always a good idea in case one fails. The other pathway that's being stimulated while this one is inhibited, natriuretic peptide pathway. So with high volume and pressure, you start overstretching the atria. And what do they secrete as you stretch them more and more? More and more atrial natriuretic peptide. And as you stretch the ventricles more and more, they secrete more brain natriuretic peptide. AMP comes from the atria, BNP comes from the ventricles, and obviously given the name, the brain. And what do those two hormones do? ANP, BNP. If you know what Ang2, ADH, and aldosterone do, then you know what these guys do, the opposite. Everything opposite. Inhibit thirst, vasodilate, inhibit reabsorption of salt and water, reduce sympathetic output. Just the complete opposite of what Ang2, ADH, and aldosterone are doing. So AMP, BNP, they are the antagonists of AAA. Ang2, aldosterone, ADH. Cardiovascular response to hemorrhage. You should be able to discuss how the short-term and long-term responses, meaning endocrine and nervous system, how these responses compensate to maintain and even elevate blood volume and mean arterial pressure. In response to hemorrhage, maintaining what we have isn't enough. We also need to consume fluid and get the blood volume back up to normal. Hormones that contribute to increased blood volume and or pressure include catecholamines, ADH, Ang2, aldosterone, so there's AAA, and EPO. What are catecholamines doing to increase blood volume and or blood pressure? Heart rate goes up, stroke volume, contractility, therefore stroke volume goes up, and because heart rate and stroke volume have both gone up, cardiac output goes up, mean arterial pressure goes up. What else are they doing? So that's the effects at the heart. Vasoconstriction, venoconstriction. How does venoconstriction help? Mobilizes some of that blood reservoir in the veins, forces it back to the heart. Venous return goes up. Therefore, EDV preload go up. Therefore, stroke volume goes up, cardiac output goes up, mean arterial pressure goes up. Aldosterone and ADH together, what are they doing? Telling the kidneys to conserve salt and water, meaning they increase reabsorption of salt and water, which means by default inhibiting the excretion of salt and water. If you reabsorb more, you are therefore excreting less. And you can look at it either way. You could say that ADH and aldosterone inhibit or reduce excretion of salt and water, or simply say that they increase reabsorption of salt and water. You're saying the same thing. EPO. Increase red blood cell production. So big picture, we're looking at response to hemorrhage. This isn't dehydration where you just lost water and you got to get the water back. You've lost water and plasma proteins and cells. Okay, so who's helping to get the water back? Right, and you're consuming water, AAA, Ang2, ADH, aldosterone. They're trying to get the water back. Who's responsible for putting the plasma proteins back? Replacing those. And this isn't regulated by hormones. This is just going to take time. Who makes almost all plasma proteins? The liver, right? So it's going to take hours, days perhaps, to get all the plasma proteins back. And then putting the red blood cells back, replacing the blood cells. Who does that? Right? Red bone marrow under the guidance of chemical signals like colony-stimulating factors for the white blood cells, EPO for the red. We've got to put everything back. We lost cells and water and proteins. What can ADH and Ang2 do to help get pressure up immediately? Vasoconstrict. Increasing TPR, increasing mean arterial pressure. And what can catecholamines do to, over the long haul, help conserve water, help the kidneys conserve what we have? Reduce blood flow to the kidneys. Mainly by constricting the arterioles that feed into the capillaries where the filtrate is formed. So here we're putting it all together. All stuff you've learned, now just looking at it in the context of blood loss. So we've lost volume and therefore pressure. This is a stress, and it does activate stress response, and hypothalamus will respond to this stress by increasing sympathetic output. But even if the hypothalamus wasn't doing that, what would make sure that sympathetic output to the heart and vessels was increased? What reflex? The baroreceptor reflex would certainly do this, right? Because you've lost volume, therefore you've lost pressure, and they would detect this. You could also assume with fewer red blood cells after the hemorrhage, you're delivering less oxygen to the kidneys. So what should happen to renin secretion? EPO secretion. It should go up. Yeah, renin secretion will go up not because oxygen delivery is down, but because of sympathetic output to the kidneys. So the chemoreceptor reflex is probably picking up on this problem as well because of the decreased oxygen in the blood. But certainly the baroreceptor reflex and the stress response. So for many reasons, there's going to be increased sympathetic output. So this is going to result in increased heart rate and stroke volume, and therefore increased mean arterial pressure. This will ensure that we vasoconstrict globally throughout the body, the quickest thing we can do to get blood pressure up. EPO is going to help us replace the cells that we've lost. AAA is going to help us replace the water that we've lost. And remember, about half of blood is cells, 45%, but roughly half. So it's not just water. We got to get the cells back too to get the overall blood volume back to normal. This peripheral vasoconstriction not only increases TPR to increase mean arterial pressure, but this also includes veins. Okay, so we are constricting arteries and veins. And venoconstriction will increase venous return, increasing EGV, stroke volume, therefore cardiac output, mean arterial pressure. Severe hemorrhage can cause hypovolemic shock. Hypo, low, volemic volume, shock, sudden drop in blood pressure. And we have lots of different types of shock, meaning lots of different things that could happen to cause a massive sudden drop in blood pressure. Vascular shock, if something is causing blood vessels throughout the body to dilate. One form of that is anaphylactic shock, in which case histamine is the culprit. It's responsible for dilation throughout the body, causing a huge drop in pressure. Neurogenic shock, that usually means something's wrong with the medulla. The cardiovascular centers were not getting appropriate sympathetic output to the heart and vessels when blood pressure goes down. Septic shock, bacterial toxins are causing vasodilation throughout the body. Cardiogenic shock, the heart is the problem. It is failing to maintain adequate cardiac output. And that could happen if you have heart failure. That could happen if you're having a heart attack. But all of those have something in common, and that is a sudden, massive drop in blood pressure. And of course, that's going to trigger the baroreceptor reflex. As usual, read up on the homeostatic imbalances, be able to answer the questions, but we have the time, so I'll go over some of this with you. Chronic hypertension is a sustained arterial pressure of 140/90 or greater. What are the long-term consequences of hypertension? What's that? Enlarged heart, because
It has to work harder.
why is it working harder? Increased afterload, exactly. So normal afterload, normal pressure in the aorta, right when the ventricle starts to contract and drive pressure up to open the semilunar valve, normally it's about 80. Right? 120/80, 80 being the lowest pressure during diastole. So right before the ventricle begins to contract, pressure is at its lowest point. So then it contracts, pressure starts to go up, and you just have to get it above 80 to open the semilunar valve. Well, now if you have 140/90, right, hypertension, now it's 91 instead of 81 to open the valve. You have to generate 10 more millimeters of mercury of pressure every cardiac cycle. Minute after minute, day after day, week after week, month after month. And yes, this overworks the heart. It can cause enlargement of the heart, cardiomegaly, and ultimately it leads to cardiac failure. The ventricles just won't be able to keep up, the left in particular. It not only strains the heart, it damages vessels. Vessels are not designed to deal with these really high pressures. So it's hard on the vessels and it's hard on the heart. Leads to cardiovascular disease. Risk factors for hypertension. And you can look at differences between primary and secondary, but just in general, smoking, drinking, not exercising, eating crappy, just basically being an American. Just being an average person. Genetic component, that's a big one. If it runs in the family, you could do everything right and still end up with hypertension. How do you treat it? Stop smoking, stop drinking, stop sitting around, eat better, and medications. Like ACE inhibitors, calcium channel blockers, beta blockers, right? Things that inhibit the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic does things to increase blood pressure, right? We're trying to get that blood pressure down. how do ACE inhibitors lower blood pressure? Right, so you inhibit the conversion of angiotensinogen to Ang1. Less Ang1 means less Ang2. Less Ang2 means less sympathetic output from the cardiovascular centers. Less aldosterone secretion. Less ADH secretion. Less vasoconstriction. Does a lot of things to alleviate high volume, high pressure. Let's move on to Frank.